We're moving on in our American discussion to our discussion of Mesoamerica. So we've come up north from South America to Middle America, essentially, which is what Meso refers to. So you're looking at this area that today is made up of countries like Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, right, as being Mesoamerica. And on the map, of course, you can see various sites, right, linked to the three civilizations we're going to speak about. The earliest, right, is the Olmec. So you'll see the Olmec located in this region here. And again, we're going to be looking at some cities right around in here, like Levanta, San Lorenzo. You can see the Maya, right, are going to be located in this region here, right? We're going to see cities like Uxmal, Chichen Itza, and they'll overlay, of course, on the area that the Olmec had inhabited. And finally, the Aztec, which will be the final culture, mainly centered up in here, right, in the northern sort of area, right? So these are the three cultures we're going to be looking at: the Olmec, the Maya, and the Aztec. We'll start, of course, by talking about some main points, right, that refer to Mesoamerican culture. So the first point I wanted to bring up is the idea of zoomorphic imagery. This is something we've touched on before, so it's nothing new to you. This idea of the zoomorphs, or the combination, right, of animal and human characteristics. We spoke about that with South American culture, and of course, I mentioned keep it in mind because you would see it again here. So we'll see a lot of zoomorphs here as well. We'll talk a bit about city planning for all these cultures, and the types of cities they created and how they're often quite intricate and advanced, right, in the type of design they were using. And then they often were very symbolic in many ways. For instance, taking into account things like cosmology or the movement of the planets, right? The stars, the sun, and the moon, and their interactions with each other, in their interactions with us humans. So cosmology often figured heavily into city planning. So we'll discuss how there are, sort of practical reasons why they would design a city in the way that they do, but also often very symbolic reasons as well. They think a lot about cosmology in these cultures. They're a very scientific society. They were very advanced, right, in considering, again, various aspects of science, right, within their culture. So these are not primitive, people in a sense. They were thinking very much about um, different types of advanced ideas, right, regarding things like astronomy, right, medical advancements and such. Uh, we'll look a lot at art related to their rulership structure. That often the monuments that you see created are to honor, right, specific rulers. So no different than if you went and looked at like Roman culture, which was known for celebrating its emperors. Let's say you can look at Mesoamerican culture and how they wanted to celebrate their rulers as well. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention, and the one that many people are eager to discuss, of course, is the role of blood in Mesoamerican culture. It takes on a great deal of significance, whether you're looking at a culture like the Maya, who use blood very specifically, very symbolically, and we're often using what we call auto sacrifice, or sacrifice from a ruler that was meant to be for their community. You can contrast that with the Aztec, who used blood on what they say was an industrial scale, that they killed people in horrifically high numbers, with this idea that their blood would appease the gods, right? It would keep the world moving, keep the world running. So blood plays a big role in Mesoamerican culture. We're going to start out looking at the Olmec. And I often call Olmec the mystery of Mesoamerica because they leave behind no written language. We have no way of really decoding who they were as people. And so they're really kind of a question mark, right, in Mesoamerican study. But they are what we call the mother culture of Mesoamerica. So they lay the foundation for the Maya and the Aztec that come later. The Olmec, right, the idea of the word, it actually refers to the word for rubber in a later dialect. And so, in a sense, the Olmec are the rubber people. Why call them this? There were heavy deposits of rubber in this region, and you see it in like the Mayan ball game later, where they make the balls out of rubber. So it may sound odd to us, but they were the rubber people, right? The Olmec, the rubber people. But they're very mysterious, and again, we have to sort of use a little bit of guessing when we look at their objects. We don't have just sort of straightforward answers about what these things were. So you have to kind of almost use your critical thinking skills and make best guesses, right, about a lot of these objects. Here's a nice close up of the region that the Olmec were inhabiting. You can see at the bottom, it shows you in greater detail the whole region, and then, of course, what the detail is that you are located in. And you'll notice that you see the major Olmec cities, places like Levanta, San Lorenzo, Las Limas, Tres Zapotes. So this is the area, right, of the Olmec. Looking at a site like San Lorenzo, right, you'll notice that today a lot of it has been grown over, and it almost looks like the kind of mounds you would see in either like Neolithic British, right, mounding, or Native American mounding that we'll talk about later when we look at the Native Americans. But originally, of course, this would have been an exposed site. I wanted to point out areas such as this that look like little volcanoes and such, because we'll talk about this in a minute at a different location. At San Lorenzo, it's famous for the excavation of these, what we call Olmec heads. And these, again, we don't know much about them, but we assume they were related to their leadership structure in some kind of way. So these are the artifacts that we find in San Lorenzo. We find these giant, massive heads, which again we assume are leadership relics. But other than that, we don't really know a lot about them. We don't have a lot of information about them. So again, we're just sort of like left asking questions about these kind of pieces. But they're monumental. They're huge. So again, it means to us that they must have been somebody important, right? Someone to care about. This is the site of Levanta, and it's a very interesting site because you have sort of two different artifacts here. You have, first of all, what we call the effigy volcano, which you see over here in this image. And then we have the mosaic pavements that you see here that were laid out in front of the effigy volcano. Now, the effigy volcano I always think is pretty interesting because it is, to me, this idea of creating something that's a fake to me to symbolize something real, right? And when you offer something in effigy, you offer it in its place, right? You're offering something in its place. That's why we call it an effigy volcano. So this region is fairly flat, doesn't have a lot of mountainous objects. Again, it's very similar to the area of North Florida that we live in, where it's very flat. There's not a lot of elevation. So what they seem to have done in this area is build fake volcanoes, right? For what reason, we don't know. Are they symbols of power? What is this really all about, right? And then they also created what we call these mosaic pavements. So on the left, you have kind of an artist reconstruction of the making of the pavements, what we think that look like, and then the actual pavements on the right. Now, what's interesting about the mosaic pavements was you can see that they were created in these beautiful, brilliant, colored, tiled designs, right? Gorgeous. But then they were covered over. So you'll notice the people in the little, reconstruction are covering over the pavements with dirt, right? They're burying them. And then they were made below ground level, so of course they were covered over even further. So when the archaeologists came to excavate, they literally had to excavate down through many, many layers to find these things, and came to understand that it wasn't time that buried them, but the actual Olmec that buried them. Now, again, we have zero idea about why you would make something this beautiful and then bury it, right? What was the purpose of that? But it seems to suggest some kind of death culture, maybe burial culture. But again, we simply don't know. Or this idea of perhaps, things that are beautiful are meant to be preserved. Again, we're just left sort of with question marks about why you would do these sort of things. Here's some other shots of things that were excavated at La Vanta. So again, you'll see some of the Olmec heads, the sort of creature on the left that seems zoomorphic. And I like the shot on the bottom right of someone actually excavating, so kind of pulling these things out of the ground. So you see how they actually were buried or often interred, right? Here's another object from Lavanta. And I show you this one because these are two altars, right, from the site, two different altars. And I show you this because I wanted you to see how they depict the leaders almost kind of like seated in these caves, and then they're almost like emerging out of the caves. So one thing you see with Mesoamerican culture is a lot of use of caves to symbolize the underworld. So we wonder here if this is this idea of the ruler being kind of between the worlds, perhaps. And again, later on in the rest of the art you see in Mesoamerica, you see a lot of this cave symbology. So again, it's something to consider here. This is another monument from Levanta. And I show you this because it's what appears to be perhaps a ruler seated in front of this snake-like creature. And later, especially with the Aztecs and the Maya and the Aztecs, you'll see the feathered serpent, god of Quetzalcoatl, specifically with the Aztecs. So again, this is the beginning of some of these gods. You know, the beginnings of the depiction of some of those gods. And finally, I wanted to sort of show you some things related to zoomorphism. The most famous one, of course, is the Kunstachs that you see here. It's an object made out of jade, and jade is plentiful in this region. It seems to have been a precious object in this region. So you see the use of jade quite frequently. And jade can be multiple colors besides green. It can be purple, it can be black. But green is the one we normally associate jade, the color we associate jade with, right? But again, it can be multiple different colors. We call it the Kunstachs because it was found by a German archaeologist. Kunst is a German word, right? But that's just a naming of something just like Raymonde Stele. It depicts what we call a were jaguar. Now, were, when you put it in front of something, just means like a man something, right? So a werewolf is like, again, a man wolf. Here, a were jaguar would be a man jaguar. In this mythology, as I mentioned, jaguars were quite powerful, right? You saw cats in South America, you see them here in Mesoamerica as well. So you see cats quite a bit in American cultures. So this is a zoomorph, of course. It's a man that looks like a jaguar. You can see the big fangs right in the mouth. And I love the idea of multiplicity here. If you look at its hands, its hands are kind of across its body and it appears to be holding something in its hands. Well, what we surmise is it was holding another little axe in its hands. So, like, in a sense, it's holding itself in its hands. And if you extrapolate out, of course, then that one's holding itself and holding itself and holding itself. And you go further and further down that rabbit hole, right? The idea of the funhouse mirror. So, just like with Indian culture, you see multiplicity here is also something that they're interested in. Why, we don't know again, but perhaps it suggests that there's more than one world or more than one existence. This idea of like passing through a cave to the underworld, that this is only one existence. They seem to believe in this idea of multiple worlds, multiple planes, right? So that kind of multiplicity. And what is an axe anyway? It was meant to be like a little chopping tool, like a hand axe, we call them, that have been used to chop things. This one's obviously ceremonial because it was made out of jade, but again, we think it descends from an actual utilitarian object. And the final things I'll show you here are the Las Limas figure and the prince. The Las Limas figure was found in a cave. So again, this weird idea of caves and what the heck that means. And it appears to be a person holding out what looks like a zoomorph, right? It's this kind of creature. It looks partially human, partially animal, perhaps like a fish. And the person is actually covered with kind of these glyphs and these designs. It's hard to see in this image, but it's covered with these kind of tattooed, like incised patterns. So again, is this magic at work, right? And then the prince, people talk about he's wearing this headdress. Um, but if you look at the face, they talk about how perhaps the face indicates someone with like Down syndrome. And why would I bring this up? Because these cultures actually looked at people who had these syndromes as being special, as being somebody who was elevated, who could see beyond the curtain of reality. So somebody with, autism, Down syndrome, right? They would not see them as negatives. They would see this as a positive. They would say this is a person who sees beyond, right? Who see things more clearly, things that we can't see. So again, it's an interesting reading of ability in these cultures.